Discussion on the zoning tools that are available to further define what's permissible. All these are quasi-judicial items. You have a conditional overlay, a development agreement, and a residential plan development, an RPD, where you can set specific use restrictions via the conditional overlay and development agreement, and then the RPD is specific to the residential. You've seen a few of those in the past couple years as well. You see the conditional overlay and development agreement very similar regarding use restrictions and the density restrictions and the intensity you can set. How they really differ is in the performance standards. So again, the use restrictions, you can set a specific use in the conditional overlay and development agreement. One of those, so you can have a zoning district that allows a broad range of uses, and you only want to allow a certain number or certain thing that maybe the developer wants to do. And that's what you could set via conditional overlay, or a development agreement could set that specific use is the only thing that could happen. Same thing for density. You can set a certain number of units per acre, or actually a certain number of units outright, either under a development agreement or conditional overlay or an RPD. Regarding intensity, you can do...
Glenn, so those would be really more restrictive,
Correct.
presumably. So the zoning category would do certain things, but if we're going to, in our thinking, want to tie them down a little tighter, we'll go with
Right.
conditional or development or...
Right, and of course, those are all up to the applicant to really apply for. We can't really make
Right.
them do that.
No.
Again, the main difference is in the what we call performance standards, where you have dimensional standards you can set via conditional overlay, things like your lot sizes. You can set specific setbacks if you want extra buffers, things like that. You set certain design standards and certain access to roadways where you want the site to access a certain roadway, things like that. However, if you want to do more things like off-site road improvements, you want to set a specific concept plan. You might want to tie up business hours and operational criteria, things like that. You would need a development agreement to do so. And the RPD is specific, because RPD zoning is so flexible. It requires a development master plan where everything could be set, like setbacks, height, things like that. You could look at the concept plans, but that's set. That's only for really residential developments. So again, all of these are quasi-judicial and tied to zoning. And conditional overlays are easier than development agreements. They're less cumbersome and less expensive. A lot of times, development agreement require an attorney to help formulate those. And conditional overlays are more popular with applicants. They've been available since August 2015. Since that time, we've had 15 conditional overlays and only 7 development agreements. So, if you want an example of conditional overlay, it's often been used for things like an ALF, assisted living facility, where institutional zoning allows a lot of different uses, but you specifically want to allow that use, so you basically limit to an ALF, and you might want to limit a certain number of beds. So conditional overlay can do that, but it couldn't set a certain concept plan. You need a development agreement to do that. All right. So looking at changing options and alternatives for land use and zoning hearing process considerations, things we want to consider is we want to maintain the review timeframes. We don't really want to extend those timeframes. We want a stable and predictable process. Again, and Jewel mentioned, you got legislative, land use versus quasi-judicial concerns. And what are the changes? What changes would be the hearing notices, the advertisements, the LPA procedures? We want to keep those the same or change them. Additional staff time, if you have to do additional staff reports, additional presentations, things like that, and potential changes to the fee schedule over time. So here we have our alternatives overview, where we have an alternative option one, where you separate, for small scale, you separate all these things. You separate agenda item, you have a separate staff report, you have a separate presentation. You'd have separate public comment time, so the public comment can happen twice, once for zoning and once for the land use. And you'd have separate motions. Again, right now, all those are combined. Our option two is a hybrid approach. This is our recommended approach. You would have combined agenda items, separate staff reports, combined presentation. I or my staff would give you one presentation, and you would have combined public hearing, public comment periods, so only one public comment period, and then you would take separate motions. And for the large scale, that would follow the same review process you decide for the small scale on dates when the land use and zoning are both heard. The interest there is, when do you want to hear the zoning? Is it at the transmittal hearing, where land use and zoning would both be considered and the zoning would be contingent on the land use? or to be at the adoption hearing where you just hear the land use. At the first hearing, you transmit it to the state, hear back from the state, and then following that, you would have your land use and zoning considerations at the adoption hearing for the land use. Okay. A little more into those options. Again, you'd have option 1, where they're completely separate, 2 staff reports, separate agenda items, presentations, separate comment opportunities and motions. And option 2, the hybrid, you would have 2 staff reports under 1 agenda item, 1 presentation, and separate motions. Again, that's a recommended option because it allows legislative and quasi-judicial components to be considered separately while giving the public 1 opportunity to comment on both under 1 agenda item. And as far as the large-scale process alternatives, review the land use and zoning at the LPA hearing per the selected small-scale process. You would review the land use and zoning at the BCC transmittal hearing per the small-scale process, and the adoption of the zoning would be contingent on the adoption of land use in the second BCC hearing. And the option 2 would be the same process under the LPA. The difference would be you would hear zoning in the adoption hearing after you transmit the land use to the state. And option 2 is a recommended option because it provides opportunity for feedback from state agencies on the land use prior to final legislative and quasi-judicial decisions. And that's how one of the last cases you heard, the one by the primary sanctuary, ended up. We started the first way, but we ended up doing zoning second, following comment period. Just one final time for our recommended alternatives. Again, small scale, you would have the 2 staff reports under 1 agenda item, 1 presentation, 1 public comment period, and separate motions. And large scale, you would review the land use only at the BCC transmittal hearing and land use and zoning the same way as the selected small scale process at the adoption hearing. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
So really, the option that you're recommending, we'd still have a motion on land use, let's say, and have the deliberation on that, and then we'd come back to the motion on the zoning. So we kind of get the best of both worlds. We have some efficiency through presentations, but yet deliberation is separate. I remember a case, I don't remember, some 3 or 4 years ago when we were talking about different things, and one of the attorneys stood up and says, well, this is quasi-judicial and you can't do that. Well, we were always combining both. So we were having land use and quasi-judicial deliberation back and forth, and we were probably either knowingly or unknowingly doing that. Right. And so they were saying, well, you can't do that. This is not a quasi-judicial, or this is a quasi. And so I think it's really important that we do separate them out for motions and deliberation. I think it makes it a little clearer.
Yeah, and I would clearly separate them in the presentation as well. I would do separate recommendations for each.
Yeah, yeah. Commissioner Justice?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I think this is the hybrid that you brought forth is the right way to do it. Not only they are 2 different issues sometimes. They're not always, one wrapped up in a nice bow. But the process by which this board reviews those have drastically different limitations. So we should be looking at them in 2 different processes. And so I'm glad that we finally got here to where we are today. It makes so much more sense, and it puts us in a better decision-making mode for all the reasons that we've talked about and all the reasons that we won't talk about today.
Yeah. And under small scale, we're not, I had one person call and say, you're not talking about 2 different hearings on 2 different days. And I said, no. We're not slowing the process down. We're just separating the discussion and presentation and discussion and deliberation. So any other questions? So I would assume that the direction that I'm hearing from you is to go in this recommended alternative that you all have given us. They're just looking for some board direction today.
Correct.
Do we need to bring this back at a commission meeting for decision, or just kind of give the direction that that's the way we're going to?
I think your direction to staff is perfectly sufficient for us to begin moving forward this way, without a vote, to be clear.
And then clearly communicate it to all of our applicants that will be how we will be doing it going forward.
Sure.
Commissioner Seal?
Yes, I just have a question really for both the small scale and the larger scale process. If the LPA has a differing opinion, or if they have some comments, or if there's, light that they shed on a matter, will that be included in the presentation that comes to the county commission like it is now?
Yes.
Okay, so that won't change.
No.
Okay, great.
Okay, so unless I hear differently, nodding heads say we're giving you that direction. Okay, there you go.
And
Thank
if-
you. Thank you.
Yep.
Glenn.
Next
Appreciate it.
up, he doesn't have to leave, is on the annexation process.